Hi, Chip. Can you hear me? Testing, testing.
Yes, we can hear you, Avery. Can you
Oh,
hear me?
good.
All right.
I can. Hello, how are you today?
I'm doing well. Apparently my microphone wasn't working.
No worries. I thought it was on my end. And does it sound like I'm coming from far away? Sometimes it looks like I'm connected to the right part of my system, but sometimes it does some funky things.
Now your voice sounds really good.
Okay, and do you usually have the speaker turn their video on for this?
I leave it up to the speaker. What
Okay,
you might
let's
want to
see.
do, okay, we can see you. And what you might want to do while you're giving your presentation is just to turn your video off, and that way it gives a little bit more landscape to the presentation. And then
Okay,
as we're asking questions, and I'll put my video on as well.
okay, that sounds good. And then when we start the actual presentation, may I share my slides and may I go ahead and test that?
Yes, I will
Okay.
make you the presenter.
Okay. And do you have any introductory slides that you need to do? So do we need to do a change over there, or when I share mine now, are we good?
I'll take back control after you test a few.
Okay.
And I just have 2 slides in the beginning just to introduce everything.
Okay. Let's see. So
So
can you see my slide?
I can see your slide,
Let's
and
see if this is better. How's that? What are you seeing?
I am seeing I'm seeing presenter view, not the presentation. There you go.
Okay.
Yep, and
How about that?
that is the presentation.
Okay, perfect. And let me swap a display one more time. Uh-oh. Hold on. Okay, and then my question for you is, can you see my mouse? I know that there are drawing tools. I won't need those as long as you can see my mouse location.
Yep, it's right there at the fish's tail.
Okay, perfect. And then I don't,
And if you want to use your mouse, you can actually do it with, I think you have an option for like a red bullet or something like that, so it stands out a little bit more.
okay, let me check that. Let's see, drawing tools menu, spotlight. Oh man, okay. It's the highlighter. Oh, that's not what I want to do. Undo. Uh-oh. What? Is that highlight going away? It's not, is it? It's nice.
It hasn't yet.
Oh, erase all drawings. There we go. Okay. Sounds like a plan. I will
Okay.
stop sharing my screen.
All right, I'll
Button.
take it back.
Excellent. Thanks, Chip. And I'll go ahead and mute myself and turn the camera off.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started in about 5 minutes. Well, thank you, everyone, for being here this afternoon. And thank you for joining us for today's seminar entitled Assessing the Spatial Footprint and Ecological Siting Principles of Artificial Reef in the South Atlantic. My name is Chip Collier, part of the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council staff, and I'll be the moderator for the webinar. The intent of the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council seminar series is to introduce new science and management into the management realm through an open forum. The South Atlantic Fishery Management Council is a regional fishery management council that provides recommendations to the National Marine Fisheries Service on fish-related issues. The South Atlantic Fishery Management Council jurisdiction is 3 miles to 200 nautical miles offshore from Key West, Florida up to the North Carolina-Virginia border. Today is an opportunity for South Atlantic Council members, as well as SSC members or the Scientific and Statistical Committee members, advisory panel members, as well as anyone else to learn about new research and ask questions about projects or the findings. Before we get into the presentation, I wanted to go over the process for the webinar today and how to operate this platform. We're going to start off with a brief description of the webinar, which I'm doing right now. Then Avery will give her presentation, and then finally we'll have an opportunity for discussion. To be part of the discussion, you can enter questions into the question box, and you can see that highlighted down here. You can type those in at any time. And the audience will not be able to see these, but I'll read them after the presentation has ended and ask the question of Avery, or we can have a discussion as the group. If you would prefer to ask your question after the, and there will be a opportunity after the presentation is over, all you have to do is click on the icon here. It looks like a turkey or a hand. If it's green, that means your hand is down. If it's red, it means your hand is raised. When it's your turn to speak, staff will note that you have your hand raised, and we will call out your name. The webinar will also notify you that you've been unmuted by the organizer. And when after that has happened, you can click on the red button up there that looks like a microphone. When you're ready to speak, it should be green, indicating that you're able to speak to the audience. This presentation today might have some neat pictures or some interesting figures. You can zoom into those using your mouse when it's actually on the display screen. Just zoom in using your pointer. After you're done looking at that focused image, you can be sure to zoom back out to make sure you're seeing the entire presentation. So with these items out of the way, I'm excited to introduce Dr. Avery Paxton. Avery is a research marine biologist at NOAA National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science, where she focuses on coastal resilience and restoration. She quantifies ecological functions of created, restored, and impacted habitats to learn which interventions can best achieve intended ecological outcomes, such as ecosystem services, community structure, or habitat resilience. Avery has a decade of experience determining ecological functions of human-made reef habitats, including artificial reefs and historical shipwrecks, and testing whether artificial structures provide similar fish habitat to natural reefs. She earned her PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and her BS in Environmental Studies at the University of Virginia. So with that, I am going to send it over to you. Give me just 1 second, Avery.
Thank you, Chip. Can you do another sound check for me, please?
We can hear you.
Excellent. Hi, everybody. My name is Avery Paxton, like Chip said, and I am going to turn my video off for the presentation, but I'll turn it back on for question and answers at the end.
Okay, we're seeing everything.
Okay, perfect. And is my control panel in the way, or are we okay?
That has been moved to the other screen.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you so much for the introduction, Chip, and thank you for joining us today, everybody. It's great to see a few familiar names on the list of attendees. So today I'm going to be talking about work that our team has conducted over the past decade on artificial reefs. And I want to emphasize that this is not work that just Avery has conducted, but this is a broader team effort, and it includes work from collaborators at NOAA National Ocean Service, NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service, key contributions of multiple individuals, including Damie Stewart, and artificial reef managers from 17 coastal states. The photos that you will see today during the presentation were mainly taken by John McCord and several by Corey Ames, illustrations by Alex Boersma, and a big thank you to the NOAA ship Nancy Foster and Office for Coast Survey for their support. And the work, again, that I'll be talking about, again, is a team effort, and multiple institutions who I have not yet acknowledged, some of whose logos are seen here, have participated in components of this work, or in the case of the North Carolina Coastal Recreational Fishing License Fund and the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, have funded large portions of it. So I want to frame today's talk within a global context, and this map is from a synthesis published in 2021 by colleagues, and it shows the physical footprint or area of the seafloor covered by built structures. And there are hotspots shown by the darkest blue colors. You can see some on the coast of Asia. And what I want to draw your attention to is that along the US coast, we are seeing areas of pronounced physical footprint of constructed items. And what are some of these items? Well, as humans are continuing to use the coastal ocean, this is often accompanied by a diversity of artificial structure types. They can include structures associated with offshore renewable energy, as well as oil and gas infrastructure. This is one of my favorite examples. This is an aerial image from Dubai that shows these geometric shapes that are artificially constructed islands. And what we'll be focusing on today, of course, are artificial reefs. And to make sure that we're all speaking the same language, we'll define artificial reefs today as structures, human-made structures that are intentionally sunk in the United States as part of state-managed artificial reef programs. And a theme of today's presentation will be that artificial reefs are a piece of the ocean planning puzzle. They typically include structures like ships, as well as repurposed materials like concrete pipes and bridges, and in some instances can include specially designed modules like the ones seen here. And they're deployed for a variety of purposes. In the US, purposes include installing these underwater on the seafloor to form fishing and diving sites for stakeholder use. They're also used as tools for enhancing or supplementing habitat, restoring habitat, for fisheries management, and in select cases for environmental mitigation as well. And I sit within NOAA in the National Ocean Service, and as Chip said, the rest of it's a mouthful, but it's the National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science, or NCOS. And what we do in NCOS is we conduct science to support planning and siting and management of resources across seascapes. And one of these resources are artificial reefs. And so what I'm going to share today are multiple case studies that we've conducted across seascapes, and these case studies are going to vary in spatial scale or resolution. So we're going to start by looking at the global performance of artificial reefs. We'll then take a national and a regional perspective, looking at the area of seafloor, or footprint as we'll call it, of artificial reef structures. And then we'll dive into more localized state-level science to support planning decisions of the North Carolina Artificial Reef Program. And I want to start at a global perspective. And one of the questions that our team had was, how do artificial reefs perform relative to natural, cat's got my tongue, reefs? And this is a question that, for those of you who are familiar with the literature, sometimes we see examples where artificial reefs tend to outperform natural reefs as far as fish habitat is concerned, but in other instances we see no difference, and in some cases we see the opposite, where natural reefs actually tend to perform better. So we wanted to assimilate global information from the peer-reviewed literature to help us answer this question by using information from multiple studies to generate what we call an effect size, or a more analytical, broader understanding of what is happening. And to do this, we searched through approximately 500 peer review papers. From these, we found 39 peer-reviewed publications that contained the type of information we were looking for to answer this question about artificial reef performance relative to natural reefs. And I've set this up, but just to make sure we're crystal clear, we were looking specifically for papers across the globe that compared fish metrics, fish community metrics on artificial structures to nearby naturally occurring reefs, whether they were coral or rocky. And the fish metrics that we were looking for were density, biomass, richness, and diversity. And the 39 studies from which we drew evidence span the globe. There are hot spots of the studies. Each study's location is shown by one of these gray circles in the United States, off the coast of Brazil, in the Mediterranean, and there are several areas such as portions of Africa where we have gaps in the ability to interpret the results of this study. So I want to put that caveat out there that we're just able to extrapolate to some of these locations where we have on the ground data from these publications. And so what did we find? I'm going to give you the punchline first, and then I'm going to walk you through it. The punchline is that we found artificial reefs do perform well on the basis of those 4 fish community metrics, but are not one size fits all. So to walk through it, I'm going to use figures that look like this. I want to set them up a little bit. On the x-axis of this one, we have fish metrics, including density, biomass, richness, and diversity. And on the y-axis, this is our meta-analysis effect size, or Hedges G. And the way you interpret this is that if a point that I'm going to show you and its error bars occurs in the portion of this plot above the dotted line, that means the artificial reef performs better on the basis of that particular fish community metric. If, in contrast, the point and its error bars occur below this dashed line, hence a negative Hedges G value, the natural reef will perform better. And if the point and/or its error bars crosses the dashed line at 0, that means that artificial and natural reefs have similar performance. And so what we found is that for density, biomass, and our 2 other metrics, richness and diversity, the performance of artificial reefs globally was similar to that of natural reefs. You'll note that for density, the mean effect size is in the positive, suggesting that artificial reefs may perform better, but the error bars here are extending across that 0 line, telling us that statistically there is similar performance. There is, I will say, a difference in the sample size. For density and for richness, we have about 30 instances each, whereas for diversity and biomass, we have fewer samples. And so we wanted to investigate this and dive under the hood a little bit more. We were pretty surprised that globally, this effect size suggests that there is similar performance. And we were surprised because we anticipated that there would be nuances, perhaps based on geographic location or components of the structures themselves, such as the material from which the artificial reefs were created. And so to do this, we again use the same papers. Here on this slide, I'm going to be showing you the results just for density of fish. And on the x-axis, I will now be plotting different factors. So here we're looking at ocean basins, and we see that in the Atlantic Ocean, artificial reefs tend to perform better than the natural reefs, and we don't see any difference in the Pacific and Mediterranean reef performance by reef type. We next looked at latitudinal zone. In tropical settings, artificial reefs tend to perform less effectively than natural reefs, but again, notice this error bar with slight overlap above the 0 line. No differences in reef performance for fish density by subtropical and temperate latitudinal zones, and in the subarctic, mind you only with 3 samples, artificial tended to outperform natural. And then when we dove a little bit deeper into this relationship, we looked at the material that the artificial reefs we were contrasting with the natural reefs were constructed from, and found that concrete reefs tended across the board to perform better than the natural reefs. And so this meta-analysis was really interesting. And again, I mentioned earlier that it was surprising, but I think as we've come to understand some of the nuances associated with this data set, what it's indicated is that artificial reefs can be effective fish habitat enhancement tools on the basis of those 4 metrics only that we evaluated: density, biomass, richness, and diversity. But there are location-specific nuances, so they are not one-size-fits-all tools that can be deployed in any given situation to have a positive outcome, for example. And so this global meta-analysis led us to want to understand how much of an influence artificial reefs may have in the United States. And the first step towards doing this was to work directly with artificial reef managers from 17 coastal states to try to calculate the area of seafloor in the US ocean, which we'll call the footprint, that these artificial reef structures cover. And many of the artificial reef managers who participated in this analysis are on the line today, and I want to extend a big thank you to them because they were intimately involved with this project and helping overcome challenges of taking data from multiple states that were in different formats and combining them, coming up with a way of doing that in a standardized fashion so that we could generate our footprint estimate. The states that were involved in this are shown here in the colors. They include states in the New England and Mid-Atlantic areas, the South Atlantic, the Gulf, and 2 states in the Pacific region. Some will notice that several states, like Washington, for example, do have artificial reefs, but their artificial reefs are in estuarine or shallower waters that were inside of the coal reg line, so were not included in this analysis where we were exclusively looking at the reef footprint in the US ocean. And the points that we're showing here, these are the centroids of permitted areas of the seafloor where artificial reef structures can be deployed. And so let's dive in a little bit more. I mentioned that the artificial reef managers were key collaborators on this project. That is because they provided source data. They provided us with multiple data streams. The first was the locations and areas of pieces of the seafloor of the ocean that have been permitted through official channels to hold artificial reef structures. So again, these are reef zones, areas of the seafloor in which artificial reef structures can be deployed. Those structures span a wide variety of materials as well as particular types of structures. Some of them are shown here. And what we needed to do to calculate the footprint was we needed to understand how much of these structures were actually resting on the seafloor. And so we developed an approach to do this using the best available data provided by the states. And I'm going to walk you through how we did this, starting with panel B. So in cases when the artificial reef structures had known measurements of their footprint, either from managers measuring the dimensions prior to sinking, or for example, conducting seafloor mapping from which the data could be used to delineate reef structure footprint, we were able to take these measured values and get a measured footprint. In multiple cases, however, measured footprints were unavailable. And so in these instances, we used an approach to estimate the footprint. So again, we didn't know the dimensions. And so to help overcome this, what we did is we categorized the large variety of structures into about 30 categories. And here's an example of one of these categories: large concrete modules, where multiple different types of modules were combined into this category. We were then able to take from our measured footprint the average unit footprint, multiply it by the number of our large concrete modules, and come up with our estimated footprint. So phrased more simply, we had our measured footprints, and then we had our estimated approaches that were based on a categorization scheme. And what did we find? We found that the artificial reef footprint is the largest in Texas. And let me orient you a bit more to this before we go into more detail. So x-axis here, we have the footprint of reefed structures themselves. So this is the footprint of the ships and the concrete pipes and other materials. And we have the state on the y-axis. The states are organized in terms of their region, Gulf of Mexico, Mid-Atlantic, etc. And so if we come back to what I was beginning to say earlier, Texas has the largest footprint of reef structures at just shy of 8 kilometers squared, followed by New Jersey at just over 4 square kilometers. And I do want to draw your attention to Florida, which we divided into Southeast and Gulf of Mexico components. And the other thing I want you to look at is the shading of these bars. So in the Gulf of Mexico, for Florida reefs, for example, the dark shading indicates structures for which we had a measured footprint, and the lighter shading indicates estimated. And here's a reminder of this down here. So if we were to sum up all of these reef footprints per state, what we get is that on the US seafloor, there is approximately 19 square kilometers of reef structure as of the end of this analysis in 2020. And so I'm an American football field, and to me, an easy analogy is to convert those 19 square kilometers into football fields, and that's about 3,600 American football fields. And so that value, that 19 square kilometers, again, just to emphasize this, this is the area of the seafloor that is covered by the reef structures themselves. However, as I alluded to earlier, and many of you are fully aware, there are larger portions of the seafloor that are permitted as zones where artificial reefs can be deployed. And so this figure on the right is now, notice the difference in the y-axis, showing the permitted reef zone areas. And we see that Alabama has the largest, followed by, in the Gulf of Mexico, for example, Florida. But again, note that we've divided Florida up into the Gulf and the Southeast components. And if we total up the permitted reef zone area in the US Ocean, it's about 5,800 square kilometers as of 2020. And this is approximately, it's really between the size of Delaware and Rhode Island. And one of the really interesting things that we learned in this analysis is that if we do the math of about 5,800 square kilometers of permitted reef zones versus the 19 kilometers of reef structures, that means that about greater than actually 99% of the permitted space is devoid of structure. And why is that? Well, in conversations with reef managers, one of the things that became clear is that these permitted zones are not meant to be full of reef structures. In fact, in many states, the structure locations are strategically sited to optimize ecological habitat value for fish by creating buffer zones, for example, or connectivity corridors, even within a permitted reef zone space. And so with this data set that our team from these 17 states compiled, we were able to start understanding how the artificial reef footprint in the US Ocean has changed over time. And again, this is the footprint of the structures themselves now that we're talking about, not the permitted reef zones. And our first record of an artificial reef that is now managed by a state program is in the late 1890s. And this plot is showing through the year 2020. We're looking at the cumulative reef structure footprint. And what you can see is that the reef structure footprint starts to grow pretty markedly in the past several decades. And in fact, if we look at the last 5 decades from 1970 through 2020, we see that there's about a 21 times increase, or nearly 2,000% in the reef footprint. But one of the interesting patterns is that in the last decade, there has been a slower growth of about 12%. And this slower growth is attributed to several factors, one of which is the cost of deploying artificial reef structures and some complications with and logistical challenges of sourcing those materials as well. I do need to point out a big caveat of this particular time series plot, which is that I told you in the last slide we have 19 square kilometers approximately of reef footprint, but here I'm showing you just about 10. And that is because for about 9 square kilometers of reef structures, we do not have known dates for when those structures sank, or were intentionally sunk, I should say. And so we have this missing data here. Even with those missing data, we do think we're able to use what we have, about half of the footprint, to understand some of these broader patterns in reef footprint over time. And so we've kind of bounced around a little bit in terms of talking about what types of structures are on the seafloor in the US. And I now want to drive that point home, that there is a large variety of structures. And here I'm showing you footprint again on the x-axis and the type of structures on the y. And the structures are grouped by material: concrete, metal, miscellaneous materials, and unknown. For concrete, the largest portion of the seafloor is covered by large modules. These are modules that are about 2 meters tall off the seafloor, they're relief or higher. We also have repurposed structures like concrete pipes that are categorized by a long and narrow shape, unspecified concrete. And then if we skip down to metal, we have multiple components like jacket bases of rigs and towers that were formerly part of oil and gas infrastructure and have now been taken in by artificial reef programs and managed through the reef programs themselves. They make up the largest portion of the footprint for metal, followed by vessels of a medium size. For our other materials, we have rock coming out as just about 4 kilometers squared. And then we have structures like rubber tires, for example, that are no longer permitted to be deployed as reef structures in some locations. And I also want to call out the unspecified or unknown components down here. Just over 5 square kilometers, we don't know the exact structure type. But we do know for many of them, as you can see with this dark shading, their footprint from seafloor mapping. And so our national analysis illuminated the footprint of artificial reef structures on the US seafloor, but we wanted to be able to put that in perspective. And so for this, we're going to narrow in a little bit geographically and focus on the Southeast US, which we define for this analysis is the area from Cape Hatteras to Port St. Lucie. And this area is going to go out from the shore to about 200 meters depth. And so what we did was we compared the footprint of artificial reefs to the footprint of natural reefs in the Southeast US region. In this left panel, I'm showing you the centroids of the artificial reef zones. And I want to reinforce that these are not to scale. And as an example of that, we have an inset here looking at one of the artificial reef zones characterized by a circle, permitted zone shape off the coast of North Carolina and the structures within. We use the data from our national analysis, but again, constrained to this particular geographic area from North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. And we compared our artificial reef footprint data to 3 approaches of estimating the natural reef footprint. The first was to use the best available seafloor mapping, ground truthing, and fish sampling data from long-term data sets and have 2 subject matter experts delineate polygons around suspected or verified natural reefs. The second method of natural reef delineation was using the published Nature Conservancy synthesis, where our natural reef, locations are shown in blue. And then the last was using a NOAA National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science model that uses a Maxent framework to predict the locations of hard bottom, shown here in blue. And so what I'm going to show you in the next slide is how these footprints compare. And we're going to start with artificial reefs. For this, we went a little bit more in detail and looked at two different ways of calculating the artificial reef footprint. One is the way I showed you earlier, based on those categorizations or classified structures. And the other is saying that of a particular plot or reef zone, X% is typically covered by reef structures. And so we average these two estimates together. And knowing that the seafloor area in this study zone going out to 200 meters depth was approximately 103 square kilometers, we found that artificial reefs in the southeast are a drop in the bucket. They're covering about 3 square kilometers, or less than 0.1% of that southeast US seafloor area out to 200 meters. And so when we did the similar exercise for the natural reefs using our three methods, our expert polygon delineation, the TNC synthesis, and the NCOS Maxent model, we found, notice the scale difference here on the y-axis, that natural reefs cover about 2,700 square kilometers of this region, which is just over 2.5%. And I should also point out these black dots. For some of our methods, we were able to calculate uncertainty. And so we have our maximum and our minimum, and then our mean that we're displaying. So again, driving home the point that nationally, about 19 square kilometers of artificial reefs covering the seafloor in the southeast US. It's about 3 kilometers squared, which is several orders of magnitude less than the amount of natural reef coverage in the same vicinity. And so the next question we had was, given these values of cover for artificial and natural reefs in the southeast US, how does the distribution by reef type vary with depth? And so here I'm showing you depth bins versus artificial reef footprint for our different methods. And what I want to draw your attention to is that the artificial reefs are clustered in the shallower depth zones, with the exception of several. And if we look at natural reefs in contrast, just a striking pattern emerges, which I think all of us would have suspected, which is that natural reefs are distributed across a broader range of depth bins from our study region, 10 meters to 200 meters. I will note that several of the methods, you can see stark differences in how they predicted depth versus shallower sites. So for example, the NCOS model may not be the most effective approach for estimating the natural reef coverage in 10 to 20 meters of water compared to the TNC synthesis or the expert polygon approach. All right. I'm grabbing a sip of water. So today, so far in our journey, we've looked from a global perspective, narrowed down to national, and then to regional. And what I want to wrap up with are some of our fieldwork efforts to conduct science to support planning. And this is mainly planning for the North Carolina Artificial Reef Program, but some of the results I think you'll find compelling and things that could be repeated or perhaps with caution extrapolated to other areas. And so this first field-based story that I want to tell is about fish at their range margins. So we know that marine life are often shifting their ranges, and this has also been documented for marine fish, as I think everybody on the call is aware. And we wanted to understand if some of these tropical and subtropical species, like this angelfish featured on a natural reef off the coast of North Carolina, we wanted to understand how they may be using these built structures provided by artificial reefs. And to put this in a little bit broader context, we were fortunate because the study region that we chose was off the coast of North Carolina at a major biogeographic transition zone where we have warm water associated with the Gulf Stream flowing north and mixing with colder waters associated with the Labrador Current flowing southward predominantly. And this sets up an area where we can have temperate subtropical and tropical species coexisting, and gives us a perfect experimental setting through observation of artificial and natural reefs to test how there may or may not be differences in how these fish species with different climate ranges are using these areas. And so we selected 30 reefs off the coast of North Carolina from Cape Lookout to due south of Cape Fear. They extend across an approximately 200-kilometer stretch. And half of the reefs were artificial, shown in red, and they included ships with the red triangles, color mix up today, and concrete structures shown in the red circles. And they also included the natural sites. Some of them were pavement type morphology, and other ones were pronounced ledges, and some were mixed hard bottom. And those are shown with the blue squares. And on each of these sites, which ranged up to about 40 meters deep, we deployed our scientific diving team, and our divers conducted belt transects, 30 meters length by 4 meters wide. And on these belt transects on each of our sites that were conducted seasonally, they counted all of the fish that they observed, they estimated the fish size, and identified the fish to the lowest taxonomic level possible. This is one of our scientific divers on one of the ship type artificial reefs, and you can see the shadow of that ship structure in the background that's nearly obscured by the school of fish. And so what did we find? We found a really interesting pattern, and I'm going to break it down for you by depth versus the abundance of tropical fish to start us out. We found that on shallow sites, up to about 18 meters deep, the number of tropical fish on the artificial versus the natural sites was similar. We found that it was statistically similar on intermediate depth sites up to 25 meters. And then our deeper sites, so those that were deeper than 25 meters, we found a difference in the number of fish that were tropical. And what we found is that the number of tropical fish on artificial sites exceeded that on the natural deep sites. And so we wanted to see if this same pattern held for subtropical fish abundance as it did for tropical. And we found that there was a little bit of a preference, if you will, for artificial structures by subtropical fish in shallow waters, no difference at intermediate water depths. And then for deep depths, we again saw this pattern where we have higher abundances of subtropical fish on the artificial structures. And this was really interesting. This was something that we hypothesized might be the case, but to have our data support this led us to a whole nother line of inquiry to try to follow a little bit more on these observational data and try to untangle the mechanisms. And so the best mechanism I have for you is that this pattern where we have some of these fish at their range margins or edges, like the tropical and subtropical, is that it may be due to trophic differences in the artificial versus the natural reefs. And I want to show you two examples. The first is of planktivorous fish, shown here as a round scad, where we see that their numbers on artificial structures exceed those on natural. We also see a similar pattern, although a little bit lesser magnitude, for piscivorous fishes like jacks. And so what we believe is happening is that there is a difference here in the trophic ecology that is manifesting in such a way that the tropical and subtropical fish are colloquially hanging out, or in our case, we're observing them in higher numbers on these artificial sites. And so we wanted to look a little bit more into these large predators to try to understand a bit more about mechanisms. And so this is a typical scene from some of our dives. We're on an artificial reef. This is another ship, and we have amberjack in the foreground with planktivorous fish in the background. And what we did this time is we looked at the abundance of overall predators on the artificial versus natural, found agreeance to what I showed you last time, where we do have more predators. In this case, actually, it's density, I believe, on artificial versus natural sites. And when we broke it down by the type of predator, first, when we looked at the transient predators, you can think of these as the quick moving, usually water column associated, sometimes pelagic predators. We found that they were really driving this pattern, whereas the resident or demersal species like snapper and grouper, for example, exhibited similar densities by reef type, and so we're not driving this pattern. And so we wanted to zoom in a little bit to these transient predators and try to understand why this may be. And it turns out that the transient predators tend to associate with reefs of higher vertical relief. So more transient predators on reefs with a higher height off of the seafloor. And this makes sense to us and is something that we wanted to test and see if it was perhaps generalizable more broadly. And so we conducted a global literature review of cases where the number of predators on artificial versus natural reefs had been reported. And we found that in many of the cases, we were seeing higher predator abundances on the artificial compared to the natural habitat types. And so this means that there may be some generality that we can extract from this study conducted locally off the coast of North Carolina. And so far I've talked a lot about shallow reefs, and one of the things that Chip asked that we also share was a synthesis that our team has conducted of 4 years of data from deep isolated structures on the seafloor off the coast of the Southeast US. And this synthesis developed from observations that I'm sure many of you all have participated in or had on your own of high numbers of groupers being observed on small, deep, isolated structures, such as this shipwreck, the German U-boat U-576, in about 800 feet of water off of Ocracoke, and the Snowy wreck as well. And so our team collated 40 years worth of data and used these data to examine grouper abundances on several isolated habitats, many of them artificial, one of them natural, and compare those to natural reefs through long-term monitoring data sets. And what did we find? Well, I'm going to show you a few vignettes here of different wrecks. The first is the Snowy wreck right here. And in 2016, the video observations that we have from this wreck suggest that there are upwards of 5 grouper per meter on the particular sampling transect. We do see that in 2004, for example, there are fewer grouper per meter, but still a substantial number. When we looked across 2 shipwrecks that lie nearly side by side in about 800 feet of water off the coast of Ocracoke, North Carolina, we're looking at different transects or sampling events here. We found that we do see high numbers of grouper per meter. In this case of the U-boat, just shy of 0.8 grouper per meter and about 0.7 per meter on the Bluefields. And then 2 barges sunk off the coast of South Carolina as artificial reefs and marine protected areas. The magnitude here ranges from just shy of 0.4 grouper per meter down to about 0.1. And the colors of these bars correspond to the species of grouper. And so we compared these small, isolated, mainly artificial structures and their grouper counts per meter to those from long-term monitoring data sets of natural reefs on the shelf edge and upper slope. And we use the Southeast Fishery Independent Survey data from the shelf edge. We use George Sebberry et al.'s data set from both the shelf edge and upper slope, and same from the NOAA Panama City Lab. And I think the pattern here hopefully is starting to jump off the page, but if we're looking at the magnitude of our grouper count per meter, we're looking at a maximum of about 0.02 compared to several orders of magnitude, in some cases greater magnitude of grouper on those isolated artificial and in one case natural structures. And so this provided our team with evidence that some of these isolated structures are likely forming hotspots for a variety of grouper species. And so to wrap things up today, I want to take a moment and reflect on some of the research that our team has conducted over the past decade and try to think about how we can use a strategic design and siting of artificial reefs as a tool to perhaps optimize the ecological functions of these structures as fish habitat. And this is a schematic that one of our collaborators, who's on the call, Zach Harrison, collaborated with our team on. And I want to set it up with that. One of the things that we've been working on with partners is trying to find ways to incorporate ecological principles into reef siting. And on panel A, this is an idealized version of how reef siting happens currently. And so we have our artificial reefs as our white and orange diamonds. They are often sited with key considerations like distance from boat ramp and thus ease of stakeholder access in mind. They are also sited to deconflict other uses spatially of the ocean, such as with shipping lanes or military zones, and are often sited far away, from other built structures and naturally occurring reefs. What our team is proposing is that by strategically thinking about the ecology of these sites using information gleaned from past studies, we can still deconflict spatial uses of the ocean with shipping lanes, military zones, etc., still site reefs so that they are optimal for stakeholder use and access, but we can take advantage of or incorporate some of our ecological knowledge to make sure that reefs are sited in a way that could facilitate, if that is our goal, connectivity corridors. And so in this case, you may, for example, want to site your artificial reef maybe a little bit closer to your natural reef, or perhaps a little bit closer to your wind turbine infrastructure. But again, this would depend upon the criteria and the goals of the management community and what they're seeking to enhance as far as fish habitat goes. So it's, again, not a one size fits all, but a statement that by incorporating ecological components and lessons learned, we may be able to help ensure that reefs function in an optimal environment. And to drive this point home, in addition to broader scale spatial planning, one of the things that could be considered is the incorporation of intentional design into these reef structures. And so this top panel shows primary functions of several types of built ecosystems or structures. In panel, on the left-hand part of the panel, we have an example from a nearshore environment of a hardened shoreline being installed to provide coastal protection. And then if we go down to panel B, this bottom part, we can see that living seawall tiles have been installed to try to increase the biodiversity. And so this is an example where the primary function, that coastal protection, would not change from the additional intentional design and the adding of these seawall tiles, but it could generate additional ecological services. Same principle could apply to living shorelines, where they may be sited for coastal protection, but simple modification to the type of structure used to create the sill could generate additional habitat value. In the case of artificial reefs shown here, our idealized tropical setting, we could have a standard design that could be adapted slightly to include more nature-inspired or biomimicry components and could perhaps generate increased coral cover. And then for offshore wind, which is becoming, as everybody knows, something that's about to scale up off our coast, we could have a situation where the wind turbine is sited to extract energy. There is a scour apron around it, and it could be possible to incorporate nature-inspired designs into the structures that make up that scour apron to maybe enhance habitat. And so I want to wrap up by quickly summarizing what we've discussed today. We've discussed global scale research through a meta-analysis showing that oftentimes artificial reefs and natural reefs can perform similarly for certain fish community metrics, but they're not one-size-fits-all solutions. We then looked at a national scale and found that artificial reefs in the US ocean cover just about 19 square kilometers of seafloor. We zoomed in to the Southeast US and found that artificial reefs are a drop in the bucket compared to the natural reef cover in the Southeast US region. And then we wrapped up by discussing field-based studies that suggest artificial reefs may facilitate fish at their range edges, their thermal range edges. And we observed that there are higher densities of large predators, especially transient predators on these structures, largely linked with the height of certain artificial reefs. And then we came full circle to discuss how there may be opportunities moving forward to further incorporate ecological principles into artificial reef design, siting, and implementation to optimize their fish value. So with that, I will stop talking, turn it back over to Chip to lead us through the Q&A session. And if you're not able to get in your question today, please feel free to reach out to me directly at my email as shown on this slide. Thank you so much for your attention and time today.
Thank you for a great presentation today. That was really well done. Very interesting.
Thanks,
So
Chip.
now it's our question and answer session. I really appreciate everybody sticking around. And if you have any questions, once again, you can use this little diagram to help you out. You can type in questions into the question box down at the bottom. You can raise your hand by clicking on the little icon that somewhat looks like a turkey. If it turns red, that indicates that your hand is raised, or you can click on the, and then we'll recognize you, and when we unmute you, you'll be notified by the webinar. Then after that, you'll need to click on that red microphone button up there to unmute your speaker. So with that, does anyone have any questions? Not seeing any questions quite yet, but that was one of the first times I've seen an area estimate for the amount of hard bottom and artificial reef off the South Atlantic coast. So thank you so much for doing that. And now I'm seeing a couple hands come up. Keith, you're going to be first. I've unmuted you. If you just click on the microphone. There you go.
Okay, thank you. Great presentation, Avery. My question is in regard to planning. Has there been any consideration or discussion about including, in discussion of MPAs, including artificial reefs as a component of MPA planning?
That's a great question, Keith, and great to see you on this channel. Our team has not been involved with discussion of including artificial reefs in MPAs. I have heard some chatter in that, and I'll actually flip that question back to Chip maybe to see if he has more insight from the council's perspective on that question that you raised, Keith.
So in all actuality, one of our artificial reefs or one of our deepwater MPAs is designed around two artificial reefs that were presented on today, the two off of South Carolina. And so that has been a consideration as a potential option for increasing some density of animals out there. So the council's definitely interested in it, and there's areas that have been designated as MPAs and are overlapping areas that where artificial reefs can be placed. All right, Jimmy Hull, you're next. Jimmy, it's showing you're unmuted, but we can't hear you. All right, we'll come back to you in a second, Jimmy.
If now.
We got you now. Oh, you went back out, Jimmy.
You hear me now?
Yep.
You can? Okay.
Yes.
Now, unfortunately, can you say, yeah, I can't hear you though. So I've got a dilemma. Well, I'll just give you my question anyway. You can? Okay. So for the last decade, fishermen have been advising the agency that we thought that they should be building artificial reef structure continuously up and down the coast. And we would hear back from the agency that they're not so sure that the artificial reefs increased biomass of, certain species, rather that it may just move it or attract it to that location. And so I was wondering if you were able to come up with any type of conclusion as to whether artificial reefs do in fact can increase the overall biomass by, in my mind they do, because they're just going to get, benthic animals going down and getting them from the beginning as far as like snapper grouper species. But you understand my question? So we heard that a lot, and I didn't know if there was any conclusion as to that question.
Thanks, Jimmy. I'll start us off on that one. That's a great and fair question. And the question is, let me repeat it to make sure I'm understanding it. Do we have any additional evidence to help understand the aggregation versus production debate as it relates to artificial reefs? And our research has not tackled that. It is, as you mentioned, a long-standing debate in the field. There is evidence out there that sometimes there may be aggregation that's occurring, and in other cases there may be production that's occurring. And we have not, again, been able to tackle that with the research body that I presented on today. But it is a very important question that I think the council is probably grappling with. So Chip, I'm going to see if you have anything else to say on that. And I know a few other people on the line. I don't know if we want to open it up, but I think they may have some perspectives on that, like Todd Kellison, for example.
Yeah, I would say I'm not an expert on that, but the one thing we do know is it's very heavily fished areas, and so it can result in some high estimates of catch and leading to some issues with reaching ACLs a little bit quicker than if they're not fishing on artificial reefs. Jimmy, did that answer your question? Or if anybody else has a comment on that?
And Jimmy, I know it wasn't exactly a satisfactory answer, but that's partially because we don't know. One thing I will say is that for the results that I presented on about the tropical and subtropical fish, as well as the large predators, again, those are snapshots from when we were able to have our divers in water conducting those surveys. One thing I did not share today is that working with the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries, we were able to monitor a new artificial reef, so a tugboat, when it was sunk right next to an existing established, much larger ship. And we did see that the types of fish on those two structures became similar or converged over about 5 months. But again, we don't have the information on where those fish were coming from that could really help us get at part of that aggregation versus production question. And I'll leave it at that and see. Todd Kellison, are you interested? I guess, can you put your hand up if you'd like to comment in a little bit more on that? I know you've been thinking a lot about that topic.
All right, Todd.
Yeah, well, so thanks, Avery. I was trying to not weigh in on this, but Captain Jimmy, it's a great question, and I think the reason that it's still a question is just because it is so hard to test empirically. It's clearly there is some attraction function of artificial reefs. I have many years ago put some artificial reef structures in off of a barge and dove on them immediately afterward, and they already had sea bass on them. So clearly there's some attraction function of them, but as you mentioned, Captain Jimmy, there's there's growth on the things that get deployed. There's juvenile fish that recruit to those and likely grow up there. And I mean, it seems quite likely to me, this is a personal observation, that in at least some cases they are increasing production, but it's just a challenge to test experimentally and show that, like, overall the population has increased because a given artificial reef or a series of artificial reefs have been deployed. But it seems reasonable to me to think that at least in some cases that is occurring.
Thanks for that, Todd. Sandra, you're next.
Just to reiterate, that was a really interesting presentation. Thank you. My name is Sandra Burke. I'm a faculty member down at the FSU Marine Lab. And apart from the question that Jimmy just brought up, have you and your team come across any kind of, what's the word I'm looking for, consistent data gaps that would be useful for, say, Keith's artificial reef program that are actually tackleable?
So one of the things that we've been discussing with multiple states, especially those in the Southeast US who are on the line, is whether it makes sense to maybe try to standardize monitoring of the types of structures that are being put into the water, so we can get a standardized database to allow us to continue to track the footprint of these structures over time. So that's one potential data gap. And there are loads of data gaps still on artificial reefs. I think, as Captain Jimmy said, the aggregation production question is a big one. But a lot of our work has been at the observational level or the synthesis level and has not gotten us down to the population level. And I think that's where we need to be for some of these key management decisions to be able to have the best informed information on which to base their decisions. So there's a load of questions, Sandra. Some of the ones that come to my mind are, how is it a good thing for us to establish artificial reefs along as connectivity corridors, right? So you could imagine that highly migratory species like a sand tiger shark, which our team has shown through a citizen science program with spot mapping, is exhibiting site fidelity to some of these sites. Is that a good thing, right? And so is it helpful to consider installing some of these structures in areas that may be hard habitat limited? Or is that something we don't want to mess with? And I don't know the answer. Same thing for some of these fish at their thermal range margins. Again, I don't know if that's a good thing that we want to be facilitating or if we should not be messing with that. I think jury's still out on those, and there's a lot more research that could be done to help understand the broader seascape ecology of artificial reefs.
All right, that's really helpful. Thank you. And my gut feeling is don't mess with it, because often when we do, things go horribly wrong. But that's an interesting question. And thank you.
Sure.
All right, Cameron, you're next.
Yeah, this is Cameron Sebastian with Coastal Scuba. So in all of the studies that you looked at, you know, obviously height is a huge factor, which everybody knows. Those are usually made from ships, which are metal, which are going to decay and deteriorate over time. And I've seen that in the 35 years that I've been diving off the coast. Are there any structures that that anyone's currently working with that actually are using concrete and height to put together so we have a structure that could last thousands and thousands of years in a vertical position?
I chuckle at your question, Cameron, because it's something we've been thinking about too. We have such a hard time disentangling the effect of reef material, metal versus concrete, right, from the effect of reef height and to an extent reef area. So these metal ships are usually a pretty small island of habitat footprint wise, but they're tall and they're discrete, whereas a concrete pipe field, it may be multiple pipes, as you know, hundreds in some cases, spread out over a much larger area with sand in between. One of the experiments I would love to see happen is a comparison of concrete pipes that have been spread out over a large area with sand in between versus concrete pipes, the same tonnage maybe, or same number of pipes that have been stacked. So you could start to maybe disentangle that relationship a little bit more for concrete and see if you are able to stack concrete pipes up to a height of a, I don't know, medium-sized vessel. How does that influence the fish community metrics that we see there and or the composition? So I don't have a good answer, but that is a question that we've been thinking a lot about and would be great to see that answered in the future.
Okay, thank you very much. Go ahead.
Caitlin said she had some response to that as well. And so Caitlin, you're unmuted.
Yeah, so I'm Caitlin Armstrong with Palm Beach County's Reef program, and Tom Twyford's also on. So I run the artificial reef program, and I was going to mention that Tom, through the West Palm Beach Fishing Club, has been building what we call reef darts, and those are 45-foot tall concrete structures intentionally built to test the hypothesis that you're discussing right now. Tom's partnered with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission to put out acoustic receivers to figure out what fish are passing by and utilizing the site. And I don't know if you're open to giving him the mic, but he can talk about what's present out there. We do have, I think, a high number of great whites have been detected more recently. There's just an array of sharks and grouper and jacks. And it's in about 500 feet of water, I should have mentioned. But they have 45 feet of relief at the max. Just for logistical reasons, that's the max we can do.
Tom, you're unmuted if you want to speak.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. Like Caitlin said, I mean, we've been building reef darts on the premise that deep water, high profile structures would be beneficial in a lot of different ways. And a lot of people think the West Palm Beach Fishing Club builds reef darts for fishermen, and that's not our primary goal. Our primary goal has always been to create deep water habitat where none existed off of Palm Beach County. We're geographically positioned close to very deep water, a lot of strong current, and we have a lack of hard substrate out there in depths of 400, 500 feet of water. So we hypothesized that if we could come up with a design that did exactly what Cameron was asking about earlier, something that would last perhaps 100 years or more, and that's what we ended up designing. It's a vertical concrete pole. It's pre-stressed. It's embedded in a base that allows it to be self-righting when you push it off the barge. And so we have created a reef dart forest in 500 feet of water. As Caitlin mentioned, where we have acoustic receivers out there, and we're seeing really good stuff happening out there. Not just the great whites, but snowy groupers, amberjacks, pelagic species like sailfish, dolphin fish, and yellow edge grouper. And so we have 160 reef darts placed in 500 feet. And we have a lot of logistic challenges with regard to staging sites and moving these big modules offshore. They weigh anywhere from 6 to 10 tons. And the highest we build them is actually 50 feet, but I'm confident we could go even higher if we just could overcome some of the logistical challenges. But we have always seen this as an opportunity for all kinds of coastal communities to build these high relief structures with readily available materials that that will be out there for a very long time doing good things. And the other thing about strategically positioning these, you know, we're in a place where the current is high. It's blowing 30 knots today. So there's a lot of things that you can do with regard to spatial planning that reduces pressure on these reef systems that you build. You can put them further away from boat ramps. You can put them in places where there's a lot of high current in very deep water. And so you give the fish an opportunity, and we're hoping to maybe see some spawning aggregations down the road of Warsaw grouper Who knows, maybe we'll get some genuine red snapper down here. We've already got them in other places. So we think we've innovated something that could be used as a template across all kinds of coastal communities with materials that are readily available that that will last for a very, very long time. And so, you know, it's still very much in an experimental phase, but with our acoustic receivers out there, we're already seeing some really cool stuff happen. And we have this stuff on a YouTube channel. So, I mean, a little self-advertisement, but just go to the West Palm Beach Fishing Club YouTube channel. And, you know, our design is not, you know, we want other people to build them too. So, I mean, we're happy to share any of our experiences with this because we believe this is an answer to some of the questions that you guys have been talking about today. So there you go.
Thank you so much, Tom. Caitlin had another comment she wanted to make.
Yeah, I know you have to move on. I was just going to say, on the heels of this exact conversation, where most of the group is familiar that we have Army Corps permits and state permits to deploy artificial reefs for any of these programs. And lately, our Army Corps of Engineers permits are coming back with limits to 7 feet in relief. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that situation, but from what I understand, it's a concern about monofilament collecting on vessels and other materials of higher relief. So it's sort of like a direct, I mean, it's kind of like a wall, you know, preventing us from creating the habitat that we'd like to. And in the future, reef darts and other structures of that type might not be possible. So I'm not sure if it's something you all can work on or discuss with your teams. Just if that's what we need to be building for reasons stated in Avery's presentation, then we might be in trouble.
Thank you for that. There was a question typed in online on asking, aside from grouper, has a comparison been done of the abundance of other benthic fish species between artificial and natural reef areas?
Yes. So off the coast of North Carolina, we have our full fish community surveys, and I've only presented part of that today. But we do have other trophic groups, we have species, we have family level, you name it, from, again, those 30 sites off the coast of North Carolina, half artificial, half natural. And so if there's particular questions, we're happy to, those data are open access. Folks are welcome to play around with them and tease out other details. And in other locations, there have been whole community surveys as well. And maybe, Keith, Millie, may I pick on you for a second? And would you be able to share a little bit about the type of fish monitoring data that the Florida Artificial Reef Program collects regularly?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's a you know, work in progress though about our fish census data, at least the data that we collect in-house. You know, we're primarily doing roving diver. We've been trying to switch more towards point count, but that is a great challenge. And I appreciate your comment earlier about the need for more standardized monitoring techniques. So I think that's something that's a work in progress nationwide and within Florida as well.
Thanks, Keith.
Wanted to let everyone know that I did put a link to what Tom was mentioning, the West Palm Beach Fishing Club, their foundation and habitat. That link should be in the chat if you wanted to go look at their website. Are there any other questions? This has been a great discussion. All right. We have taken up quite a bit of Avery's time, so I know she's ready to get back to her normal job, but it was a really great presentation, and thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, everybody, for joining in, and Chip, thanks for the invitation and for hosting today. It's great to see everybody on this channel.
Everyone have a good afternoon.